All right. Welcome back. We're diving into some pretty intense stuff today. Genesis chapters 4 through 10.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
talking about the first murder in the Bible, a
Right.
worldwide flood,
Right.
and even a genealogy that's like a who's who of ancient civilizations. You might think, oh, I know these stories,
Yeah,
but trust me, there's always something new to find.
absolutely. There's layers to these narratives. People tend to simplify them, as little morality tales, but they're really wrestling with these massive questions
Hmm.
about human nature, our relationship with God, the foundations of civilization even.
Yeah.
It's dope stuff.
Definitely. Let's start with Cain and Abel. That's a story that I think has really stuck with people. Right away, there's this tension. Abel, the shepherd, brings the firstborn lamb from his flock, and Cain, the farmer, brings just fruit of the ground, it says. What do you think about that? The difference in their offerings, I mean.
Hmm. Well, you know that one detail has caused a lot of debate. You see, some scholars look at Abel's offering, the firstborn, as like a symbol of real sacrifice. He's giving the best he has. But Cain's, on the other hand, well, it doesn't say what kind of fruit. So it makes you wonder, was it really given from the heart?
Yeah. It's like, what makes devotion genuine? Is it what you do, or is it what's in your heart when you do it?
Exactly.
It's something we all struggle with in different ways. And the story doesn't shy away from the consequences. God accepts Abel's offering, but not Cain's. And Cain doesn't react well.
Yeah, not well at all. He's just eaten up with jealousy and rage. God actually tries to talk to him, saying, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. So it's about free will. Even when we're tempted, we still have the power to choose what we'll do.
Powerful stuff. But Cain makes the wrong choice. Murders his own brother, then he tries to hide it, asking God, am I my brother's keeper? That line, I mean, it's almost become a way to describe people refusing to take responsibility.
It has. But even in this horrible act of violence, there's a bit of, I don't know, mercy, I guess you could say.
Hmm.
God punishes Cain, makes him wander the earth, but also puts a mark on him for protection. Now, what that mark means, well, that's up for debate. Some think it was, a visible thing. Others say it was his reputation, and still others think it was symbolic. What do you think?
It's always been a fascinating detail for me. It's almost like God knows that humans can fall into darkness, but he's still offering some hope, a chance to come back. But, even with all this tragedy, life goes on. The story turns to the families of both Cain and Seth, another son of Adam and Eve.
Yeah, and in those family lines, you start to see two different paths. Cain's descendants, they're all about worldly stuff, it seems, building cities, learning crafts, getting power. There's even a brutality to their story. It culminates with Lamech. He brags about killing a young man. It really paints a picture of people moving further and further from God.
Then there's Seth's line, which leads to Noah. The Bible calls him righteous in God's eyes. But before we get to Noah, there's Enoch. He walked with God, and then God just took him. No death. What's that about?
Yeah, Enoch's story, it really stands out. All this violence and corruption around him, and he's different, suggests that even in a world that seems lost, it's still possible to connect with God. A reminder that there's always another way to live.
Then we get to, I think, the most famous story in this whole section,
Mm.
the Great Flood. It's captured people's imaginations forever.
And it's not just about destruction either. It's about a world that's lost its way. Humanity's so corrupt that God decides to just start over. But even in that judgment, there is a glimmer of hope, right, Noah?
Right. He finds favor with God because he's righteous, and God chooses him to build the ark, this enormous, just gigantic boat to preserve life on earth. Thinking about the size of that thing is just mind-blowing.
The text actually gives us the dimensions. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. That's, just the resources, the labor, the logistics of building something that huge, and then gathering two of every animal, male and female, so they could reproduce.
It's a massive undertaking. You have to wonder about the mental and emotional toll it took on Noah and his family. They're building a world inside a world.
And there's this one detail. Among all those animals, God told Noah to take 7 pairs of clean animals and just 2 of the unclean ones. That difference between clean and unclean, it actually foreshadows the dietary laws that became so central to Jewish tradition later on. It's like this story is laying the groundwork for what's to come.
It's like a domino effect. Everything influencing what comes next. Shaping history, I guess you could say. So the ark's built, the animals are on board, and then the rain starts. It rains for 40 days and 40 nights nonstop. It floods so much that even the mountains are covered. It's a powerful image, the power of nature, and maybe the consequences when humanity goes too far.
It's interesting, though. The flood isn't just a Bible story. There are similar stories all over the world, ancient Mesopotamia, Native American traditions. It makes you think, was this a shared memory of some huge disaster? Or is it something deeper, something all humans understand? This idea that destruction and renewal are part of life.
That's an interesting thought. I've always been curious about those connections, how these ancient stories seem to echo each other across time and different cultures. It's like we're tapping into something primal, something that resonates deep within us.
It's what makes these stories so powerful and lasting, I think. They speak to something fundamental about who we are, our origins, maybe even where we're headed.
It's like looking into a mirror.
Yeah.
It reflects not just us as individuals, but the entire human experience.
Exactly. And I think as we go deeper into these chapters, we'll find more of those reflections, more things that make us question, wonder, and maybe understand ourselves a little bit better.
Okay, so the waters go down, and the ark ends up on Mount Ararat. Noah sends out a raven, and then, well, everyone knows about the dove, right? He sends it out 3 times. Why do you think the dove is such a big deal in the story?
It's pretty powerful, isn't it? The dove coming back with that olive leaf. It's like this image of hope coming out of all that destruction, like life starting over. But it takes time, right? Noah has to send the dove out 3 times before it finds dry land. It's like there's this anticipation, this waiting for a sign that things are getting better.
And that's when God makes that covenant with Noah, promising never to destroy the world with a flood again. The rainbow, well, it becomes this symbol of that promise. It feels like a big moment, like the relationship between humanity and God is changing.
Yeah, it's like they're coming back together. God's recognizing that even though humans mess up, there's still good in them. There's still a future worth saving. And part of this new covenant is that God gives Noah and his sons power over the animals. He even says they can eat meat now, but there's this one rule. They can't eat blood. What do you think about that?
It's always made me wonder. It's like there's this idea that life is sacred, that we need to respect the animals even though we're allowed to eat them. It's kind of a tricky balance,
It is, and it points to something that starts to emerge in this part of Genesis, how important human life is. God says it directly, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made man." It's the first time murder is forbidden. God's saying that human life is sacred because it reflects him.
It's an idea that's lasted through history, hasn't it? It's influenced laws and ethics in so many cultures. Even when we make mistakes, there's something from God in each of us. But then the story shifts to Noah and his sons. Noah drinks too much wine, and his son Ham sees him naked and tells his brothers. But Shem and Japheth, they cover their father without looking. And then Noah curses Canaan, Ham's son, saying he'll be a servant to his brothers. That's a passage that's been used for some awful things, sadly.
It's a tough one, for sure. People have twisted its meaning to justify things like racism and slavery. But you have to understand it in context. Historically, it's probably talking about conflict between tribes, power struggles between Noah's descendants. It's not about one race being better than another.
It's a good reminder that we have to read these ancient texts carefully.
Yeah.
What people thought they meant back then isn't always what people try to make them mean today. Okay, let's move on to something a little more fun at the Table of Nations. This is like a family tree, showing how Noah's sons and their kids spread out and populated the world after the flood.
And it's not just a boring list of names. It's like a window into the beginnings of different cultures and people. We've got Gomer, who's associated with the Sumerians, Magog, linked to the Scythians, Javan, who might be the ancestor of the Greeks, and so on. It's like a puzzle, connecting these old names to groups and places we know about today.
It's amazing to think about, isn't it? It's like we're seeing the roots of civilization growing out from this one point after the flood.
And then there's the Tower of Babel. This is how Genesis ends this section. It's a story about human ambition, that desire to reach for something more, and what happens when you go too far.
This one's always stuck with me. It's the classic story of pride, right? Humanity, all working together to build a city with a tower that reaches all the way to heaven, like a symbol of how unified they are, how powerful. It's almost like they're challenging God, don't you think?
Well, it's definitely a bold move,
Right.
and God definitely notices. He sees their pride and how if they stay this unified, this focused on defying him, they could become too powerful. So he does something about it.
And that's where we get the word Babel from, right? God mixes up their languages so they can't understand each other anymore. This huge project, it falls apart. People scatter across the earth, speaking different languages, going their separate ways.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? A warning about what can happen with too much ambition. But it also explains why we have so many different languages. It's like God knew that if everyone stayed together, focused on one goal, it would lead to more division, more conflict. So he separates them and makes them speak differently. It creates a necessary distance between them.
It's a fascinating way to look at it.
Yeah.
But then you wonder, right, this division, this trouble communicating, isn't that part of what causes problems for us too? We see it all the time, even today.
We do. And maybe that's part of why these stories are still relevant. They talk about the challenges we face as humans, the things we keep doing over and over, the big questions about who we are, how we treat each other, and how we relate to God.
It's like these early chapters of Genesis. They're like a blueprint for all of human experience, all the good and the bad, the creativity and the potential to destroy ourselves.
And through it all, there's this back and forth between humans and God, our desires bumping up against his will. It's something I think we're all still figuring out, even today.
Yeah, it's that glimmer of hope, that things can get better, that keeps me coming back to these stories. They remind us that even when things look really bad, there's always a chance for things to change, to grow, to have a better future.
That message really does last, doesn't it? It wasn't just for the people back then either. It's for us too. Anyone who's looking for wisdom, some kind of guidance, or even just a little reminder that we're not alone in all this.
Yeah, exactly. We're all part of this big human story, like a tapestry made up of all these individual threads. And these first few chapters of Genesis, they're like a look at how that tapestry started, the patterns that are still shaping us today.
It's like we're holding up a mirror, right? And we see all the good and the bad, the beautiful and the broken. And maybe by looking at it, we understand a little bit more about who we are, where we came from, and what it means to be human in this crazy world.
So we're wrapping up our deep dive into Genesis chapters 4 through 10. What's one question you'd leave our listeners with? Something to them to think about as they go about their day.
I'd ask, how do these stories, from all the way back at the beginning of humanity, how do they relate to your life today? What speaks to you? What makes you uncomfortable? And how can you use what you've learned from these stories in your own life, in your choices, your relationships, the way you interact with the world?
Those are some great questions. And they really show how important these stories still are. They're not just old, irrelevant things from the past. They're alive. They speak to us, even thousands of years later.
And when we think about these stories, we become part of that conversation too. We bring our own ideas and understandings. It's a dialogue that goes beyond time and culture. It connects us to all the people who have searched and told stories throughout history.
Well, that just about does it for our deep dive today. Thanks for coming along with us on this journey through Genesis chapters 4 through 10. It's been awesome exploring these stories with you.
It really has. I've enjoyed it. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep looking for those little glimmers of hope that light the way.
And definitely come back for our next deep dive, where we'll keep digging for treasures and looking at the amazing power of these timeless stories.